late start. So we're looking at the Geonim and just trying to understand the scope of their activities and some of the background to the functioning of the Geonim, along with eventually, hopefully, getting to the philosophy of the Geonim, in particular the towering figure of Rav Saadia Gaon, who we will meet today for the first time. We spoke last week about the battle the Geonim waged against the Karaite heresy. And we spoke a little bit about the history of the Karaites and the sort of 5-century battle from 7th really to 12th until they were moved to the periphery or the fringe of the Jewish world. They still exist, as we said, but haven't been a significant force in the Jewish conversation since roughly the 12th century. I forgot to mention, or should have mentioned, 2 points which, from a halachic perspective, may somewhat link to this period. I mentioned various practices that are associated with the battle against the Karaites. For example, perhaps a rise in the prominence of Halachos Ner Shabbos and having hot food on Shabbos day, which is linked to the debate between the Karaites and the Rabbenu. That's us, those who follow Torah Sheba'al Peh, who believe that lo Savaraim b'chol moshe v'seichem, the prohibition against lighting flames on Shabbos means you can't don't kindle lights on Shabbos rather than don't have fire burning. However, today I want to mention just very briefly before we move on from the Karaites, 2 other quasi-halachic positions which again may be linked to the battle against the Karaites. And both of these we've discussed in the past. At the time I didn't sort of historicize them, but now I wish to do so. I'll mention that whenever you see a halachic view and you sort of explain it with a historical context, this is always speculative historically. We don't, a figure that advances a halachic view doesn't say I'm doing so because of historical circumstances. They argue that this is a Torah, this is their understanding of Torah. And we always therefore have to be cautious in so doing, because if we ascribe a sort of a political or historical basis to the argument that was put forward, then we're playing with fire, because are we in somehow diminishing the halachic authority of this view? So this is always something sort of that has to be proceeded with caution. When a particular figure says a particular view, if we try and explain it with non-extraneous Torah factors like historical or sociological circumstances, we have to be confident that we're getting it right, or at least be modest and realize this is speculative, and also be very cautious about what are the implications of this. Are we somehow lessening the sort of timeless value of this position? Nonetheless, and with that caution said, I just want to share with you 2 halachic or quasi-halachic positions, both of which later generations already amongst the Rishonim suggested may have been linked to historical circumstances, the battle against the Karaites, and therefore I'm on sort of relatively safe grounds in suggesting this. The first is the outstanding position, the extraordinary position of the BeHa, the Halachos Gedolos. So this is a Gaonic era work where we're not entirely sure who the author was, but certainly a very, very prominent Gaonic era work. And he is amongst the first, if not the first, to list the 613 commandments. Now, in a moment, you will be remembered, certainly those who were already part of the show at the time of COVID. Those who weren't, the recording is available still on YouTube. That's when I started recording my shiurim. And quick plug to listen to that series. But let me give you a little bit of background. The Mishnah, the Gemara in Makos brings a tradition based upon various sources, including a Gematria, that there are 613 commandments. Now, this is a classic Agadic Gemara. The Gemara makes no claim to have halachic significance. It's a medrash, and the Gemara doesn't list the 613 commandments. However, from the era of the Geonim through to the era of the Rishonim, there was interest in listing the 613 commandments. Now, you may say, well, no problem. What's the issue? Just count the commandments in the Torah, and surely you will come up with 613. And the answer is not so simple. What's included in the count? Let's give a few examples. What happens if the same mitzvah is instructed several times? Is it the number of instructions? In other words, if I do that mitzvah several times, the pasuk says twice, which will translate for our purposes as don't eat milk and meat, don't cook milk and meat together. If I do, have I transgressed 2 prohibitions because it's listed in the Torah twice, or have I transgressed 1 because it's at the end of the day, 1 core point is being made? What happens if one verse includes several prohibitions? Is that 1 prohibition or several? How do I do the count? What about mitzvahs that include multiple elements? tefillin shel rosh and tefillin shel yad, arba minim, tzitzis, which have the tcheles component and the white component. What are the relationships between these components? Are they, if I shake 3 out of the 4 minim, have I done 3 mitzvahs but not 4? Is this all one combined mitzvah? And the cases aren't symmetrical. Each case needs to be analyzed halachically and conceptually in terms of how the count of the mitzvahs should go. What about mitzvahs which are just for one generation? A whole array of instructions about how to build the Mishkan, tens of instructions. Are these amongst the Taryag mitzvahs, the 613 commandments, or no, because they were just for one particular generation, but not timeless instructions? Instruction not to ascend Har Sinai. There's a sort of metaphorical fence around it. Is this a timeless instruction or just a one-generational instruction, a one-off time in history, and therefore shouldn't make the list of the 630 commandments? The confusion abounds, hence a whole genre of Torah generated by listing the 613 commandments. Now, the BeHa forms his own list of 613 commandments, of which 7 are mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, rabbinical mitzvahs. So the BeHa puts forward the stance, and this is what we discussed in our series over COVID. We looked at mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, and we asked what is the authority of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, and we looked at various sources. But the first one I started with, which we call the maximalist position, I very often like looking at spectrum of views. So you have a minimalist position, which sort of limits the authority of the d'Rabbanan in most extraordinary way. But we have a maximalist position that argues in some shape or form that somehow even the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan are given on Har Sinai. The Gemara in Makkos, the Taryag mitzvahs, the concept of is Torah tivul anu Moshe, by the way. Moshe commanded us 613 mitzvahs, and somehow Moshe was aware of the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan and said, when the right trigger in history occurs, give these mitzvahs d'Rabbanan come into force. Now, the BeHa's viewpoint, for obvious reasons, is extraordinarily difficult and very, very hard to understand. And we're not going to go into that whole discussion. As I said, listen to the YouTube recordings of that fascinating series, where we look at what the authority of D'Rabbanan is. Now, again, whenever we ascribe historical explanation to a stance of a great figure, great figures are complicated people with an array of things going on, and we should never chas v'shalom diminish a Torah viewpoint by saying it's merely part of a polemical battle or the like. Nonetheless, the BeHa emerges and achieves success at a time when the battle with the Karaites is taking place. For obvious reasons, why might it be a helpful halachic stance to argue that even mitzvahs d'Rabbanan have Sinai authority to them? Well, we're living in an era in which the Karaites are questioning the authority of interpretive rabbinic structure. To what degree of authority is owed to the interpretations of Chazal? When you learn Gemara and they take a posuk which doesn't seem to obviously mean something, but through their understanding the hermeneutical principles and so on, it's interpreted in a certain way. Does that have rabbinic authority? And do mitzvahs d'Rabbanan have authority? What's the nature of rabbinic authority to create new timeless commandments? Well, the BeHa, at least according to the BeHa, we have an answer. This is all part of Torah tivul anu Moshe, Merosha Kehilas Yaakov. The Ramban, when he speaks about this BeHa, the Rambam, when he speaks about this BeHa, he says, you have created a wall around Torah, but it is a flimsy wall that's going to crumble upon attack. In other words, you think that you have established and strengthened the authority of the rabbis by so doing, and maybe for someone who never probes that structure that you've built, that's great, because a person who doesn't probe it reads this BeHa and thinks, okay, how can my Karaite heretical brethren be correct? After all, this is all from Moshe on Har Sinai, so obviously they're wrong, their view is ridiculous. But anyone who probes and attacks the wall will see that the wall comes crumbling down, because this is an untenable position. How can you argue that rabbinic decrees also come from Moshe? So again, we're not going into whether this was the motive of the BeHa or wasn't the motive of the BeHa, but certainly later great Rishonim say to the BeHa, you think that you're defending the authority of the rabbis, but actually you're weakening it, because anyone who probes will just end up feeling fooled, because they say clearly this is an unsound basis on which to build the authority of the rabbis. Again, the BeHa is from the great Geonim, and it remains therefore a voice in our Masora, but in practice, later generations rejected from the Rishonim already, rejected out of hands this view of the BeHa. The Rambam is very, very critical of this view and attacks it very strongly. Either way, this is one example of a maximalist position adopted at the time of the confrontation with the Karaites, who are questioning rabbinic authority. and we can but speculate that maybe the two are somewhat linked. Who knows? A second example of this, again part of a separate series in I think done on the COVID, and again available on YouTube, is what exactly are we meant to make of all the drashas in the Gemara? To what do they owe their authority? What gives them authority? Well, who says Chazal were always right in how they were dorish psukim? And if they made mistakes, do they have authority? Then how do we deal with all of that? Again, a lengthy series that we looked at previously. And again, there's a maximalist position, middle positions, and a minimalist position. However, the Geonim put forward a maximalist position, which is all the drashas of Chazal also were received from Moshe on Sinai. We asked a question when we began that series: how much of Torah was Moshe taught on Har Sinai? Was he taught everything? There are different midrashic and agadic sources around this in Chazal. Remember one famous agadic source in which says Moshe somehow mystically attends Rabbi Kiva's shir and doesn't understand the shir. In other words, there's true rabbinic innovation taking place, somehow granted to the Rabbonim is authority to innovate, to interpret Torah in an innovative manner, and that's a sort of almost like a postmodern view of multiple voices and interpretive ability versus an alternative view which says that everything that's Abai and Rava were going to be Mechadesh. All of that really was given to Moshe on Har Sinai, perhaps forgotten over the generations, perhaps carried on as an old tradition and later attached to interpretation and so on. The Gaonim advanced a maximalist position. Everything was given to Moshe on Sinai, and drashas of Chazal are merely notes and ways of attaching these interpretations, these traditions to the text and the like, but there isn't true rabbinic innovation really taking place in the thought of Chazal. And again, I don't want to rush what's a complicated matter. I equally don't want to historicize anything the Gaonim are saying and thus negate their view. Nonetheless, again, the Rambam quite significantly attacks this view, and it may be tied into the rise of Karaite authority, or Karaite challenges rather, and a sort of need to base rabbinic authority on stronger traditions and the like. We'll see today another example, actually, of where the Rambam explicitly says about a position advocated by the Geonim, that this position was adapted due to the needs of the time, but we shouldn't take this as the final sort of Geonic view on the matter. So we have to be cautious around, when we learn texts, speculation about reasons behind the text, speculation about the degree of historical, sociological impact. Anyone who studies history knows these matters are famously fraught. They are more fraught within the context of Torah, where we have to be very careful not to undermine authority. Nonetheless, the Rishonim already, and obviously certainly later academic studies, speculate, and I'm simply sharing with you that these are two very interesting positions of the Geonim: maximalist position in rabbinic authority, maximalist position in Torah Shabbal Peh authority, and we can but speculate linked to the rise of the Karaite challenge. Let's move on to other battles waged by the Geonim. And these are all important and remain in some ways current or topical to this day. The next battle waged by the Geonim is the extent or the balance of power between lay Jewish political authority and rabbinic Jewish political authority. Now, obviously, here I'm on the side of the maximalist rabbinic authority viewpoints, and that's my but more seriously, this is obviously an issue that remains on a small scale, I suppose, in every community and every shul, and certainly on a larger scale when Klal Yisrael comes together in large collections, such as in Eretz Yisrael today. And throughout the generations, this has been a battle. Do we say to the Rosh Yeshivas, you stay in the Yeshivas, run the Yeshivas, teach halacha, but it's our job as lay leaders to make sure community functions well in its interactions with the secular government, in its communal policies, and its budget, and in its executive functions that need to take place. On the other hand, there are Torah viewpoints about all these matters, so surely there needs to be a rabbinic point, maybe even a rabbinic veto. How do we balance these competing ideas? Quick plug again, I gave a series, I think also in COVID, on Das Torah, And again, very, very topical today. The different positions on Das Torah, to what degree is their concept of Das Torah, which is maximalist, which means that there's a Torah voice, perhaps a final authoritative Torah voice on every issue that confronts the Jewish world. And again, there we saw Rambam and Gaonic views on the matter, and we saw many later views on the matter also. However, this is a tension between the Geonim and the secular or lay leadership of the political leadership of the Jewish body. By the way, in this stance, the Geonim don't always take a maximalist position. They definitely wanted to work with the lay leadership. However, there are sometimes tensions depending on the Geonim involved and the lay leadership involved, and depending on what's going on in the time. So the Geonim certainly wanted to work with the lay leadership and were open to the concept of lay authority. This is not a sort of battle between maximalist and minimalist positions. Nonetheless, there are times when they got on less well with the lay leadership, either because the lay leadership was more problematic or because they were disagreeing with their views, and this remained a point of tension. Who are the lay leadership at the time of the Geonim? The Reish Galusa. Interference here. Let me just mute everyone, please. Okay, mute all. Okay, so who are the lay leadership at the time of the who are the lay leadership at the time of the Geonim? The Reish Galusa, the so-called exilarchs. Reish, the heads, Rosh, this is an Aramaic word, Galuta, of the exile. So the heads of the exiles. So there is a lay leadership, a very, very powerful lay leadership, running concurrent with the era of the Geonim. What do we know about the history of this Reish Galusa? It's an inherited role, by and large, though there are various dynasties. They claim, and the claim is accepted by the Geonim, that they have Davidic descent, and they are clearly very ancient, certainly from historical records dating back to the 2nd century of the Common Era, and according to tradition, dating back to the 5th century before the Common Era. So very, very ancient. So by the time you reach the close of the Gaonic era, let's say the year 1000, they've been around for a minimum of 800 years and a maximum of 1,400 to 500 years. A vast historic reign. So very, very powerful figures. Many of them famous in their own right. Many of them top-tier Talmidei Chachamim, occasionally uniting the office of Gaon and Exilarch, because sometimes they're top-tier Talmidei Chachamim, occasionally terrible Amaraim that do awful things, as you would expect from any sort of dynastic authority. And as you would expect from such a powerful position, politics, infighting, debates over inheritance, and struggles over the extent of authority. For example, when you have a debate over who's to inherit the position, who do you turn to? The based in, there are Dayanim, or the Geonim. So you have Gaonic involved in... I'll mute once more, and then I'm just going to have to remove you if we continue getting unmuted. I apologize. You know who you are. Okay, I'm sure it's a mistake and not deliberate, but nonetheless. So Geonim are debating, are sometimes being involved in dynastic disputes because that's their job to paskin. Similarly, at different times in history, the Reish Galusa are claiming authority to appoint or at least veto the Gaonic appointment. So you have sort of mutual involvement in each other's affairs. It's not as if there's a sort of complete separation of church and state or you know, Gaonic academy and Reish Galusa authority. Yes, Johnny.
Back 1,500 years, do you mean the position of Reish Galusa? Or that they could just trace their genealogy back?
No, trace the position of Reish Galusa back. Okay. Now, there's debate about how far back goes. We know it definitely goes back 1,000 years. By the close of the Gaonic era, it's an institution that's been around 800 to 1,000 years. And according to tradition, dating back 1,500 years. Who are the early Reish Galusas in tradition? Well, they may not have used the title Reish Galusa, but there were certainly secular and religious leadership of the Jewish people from the time of the Babylonian exile and on. Quick plug now, Wednesday evenings, Nehemiah and Ezra share. That's what we're discussing by coincidence at the moment, right? And we're looking at the balance between the rabbinic leadership, personified perhaps by Ezra, by Yeshua Cohen Gadol, and the, if you like, lay leadership, personified by Zerubbabel and various other figures. In fact, the very first, if you like, lay leader of the exile is Yoachim, who goes into exile with Bavel, right at the dawn of the Babylonian exile. And according to tradition, and it's not surprising, when the Jewish king exiled to Bavel arrives in Bavel, Jews grant him authority. Who else is going to be the lay leader other than the exiled king? So the authority of a secular Davidic leadership in Bavel, in some way, shape, or form, we know dates back to the very start of the Babylonian exile. Whether they sort of formally entitled themselves Reish Galusa and when that took place, and to what degree they sort of ran a court, etc., who knows? And maybe that's later history. As I said, though, we have named Reish Galusa. This is a matter of historical record for hundreds and hundreds of years. So really ancient office. And they run a court. They have a sort of a royal house of sorts, and they have a court structure. And through much of the time, they're recognized by the later Persian authorities, and then by the Arab Caliphate when it in turn takes over in the 700s, takes over Bavel. So they're granted autonomy by the relatively liberal rulers of that part of the world. Again, there's ups and downs. There's waves of persecution of the Jewish world. It's not as if it was always good in Bavel, but by and large, the Jewish community prospers and flourishes in Bavel till all the way to the end, under Persian secular rule and then Muslim rule. And they grant self-management to the Jewish community, and that self-management is in the hands of the Reish Galusa, the exilarchs who run affairs, and they are a very powerful position. The Gemara mentions this as an institution. It's mentioned both in the Talmud Bavli and in the Talmud Yerushalmi. And in fact, the Nissim in Eretz Yisrael contrast themselves unfavorably with their cousins in Bavel. So the Nissim in Eretz Yisrael, that's the family of Hillel, who also have a type of dynastic authority, but only a rabbinic authority. They are the Nossi, the heads of the Beis Din. I'm talking about Hillel and his descendants, Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi, Rabban Gamliel ben Shimon, Rabban Shimon Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel II, and so on, all the way through to the close of the Hillel dynasty, Hillel HaKoton, or Hillel II, who's 15 generations after Hillel I. So for 15 generations, you have the Hillel dynasty who are acting, and we're going to meet Hillel II in a few moments, by the way, later on in today's share. You have the Hillel dynasty who are Nissim in Eretz Yisrael, and they are cousins of, because they're also Davidic descent, they are cousins of the Roshei Galusa, distant cousins of the Roshei Galusa in Bavel, and they say we have far less power than our cousins in exile. The Reish Galusas have much more power. It's possible that Hillel's family are only descended on the female branch from David, and therefore they say we have less authority. They link to this pasuk of Lo Yosef Shevet mi Yehuda u'Machokek mibgein Raglov. The tribe of Yehuda has a shevet, a stick. The Roshei Galusa have a stick. They have a police force. They have authority, a secular authority, and they are mi Yehuda. They belong to the tribe of Yehuda because they are of male descent from the house of David. Or Machokek mibgein Raglov. Rulers, Machokek. This is from the language of the blessing of Yaakov. Machokek from the lashon of Chok. Those who can make law, i.e., Dayanim, Roshim of the Sanhedrin, are mibgein Raglov, from the descendants of David, of Yehuda, but not from the sort of premier line, from the junior line. And we only have Machokek, we only have legal authority, halachic authority, but we don't have shevet, we don't have secular authority. We're weaker than our diaspora cousins who are also ruling the Jewish world. So these are the secular Reish Galusa authorities. And again, there's whole dynastic traditions that we have of them. I'll just mention, for the purposes of our discussion, three figures who are type of Roshei Galusa. I already mentioned the founding Reish Galusa, if he had that title, but according to tradition, and it makes sense, first secular leader in Bavel, who's Yoachim, as we mentioned already. He's the king of Yehuda, who's carried off into captivity. I'll jump forward to Mar Zutra II. Mar Zutra is familiar to people who learn Gemara, the name of one of the Amaraim, but it's also the name of one of the exilarchs. We're talking here in the year 455 or so. There's chaos in the secular Persian world. There's a dynastic dispute going on. There's a civil war. There's dynastic politics, and the Persian king the Persian king is powerless, and Mar Zutra makes, I'll give you a chance to guess whether this is a wise decision or an ill-fated decision. He makes the decision to declare independence of the Jewish population in Bavel. Does it end well or not? quick guess, ends disastrously, of course. But the Jewish population is very powerful, very wealthy, perhaps 10% of the population. And he decides that it's time for Jewish autonomy in Bavel. And of course, it all goes pear-shaped, it ends disastrously. And there's a wave of anti-Jewish persecution, and indeed a massacre of the Reish Galusa dynasty. And here we get to the legend, the famous Bustanai legend that some of you may have heard, that the king wipes out the whole population, or anyone who can claim relationship to the Reish Galusa dynasty is massacred, and one child is smuggled away, and sounds funny, the word smuggled. Okay, and one child is hidden away and survives, and the king has a nightmare, a recurring nightmare, that he is in the garden, and his chief gardener is cutting down all the trees, and he's got the Persian kings are big into pleasure gardens, right? This is already recorded in Achashverosh's story. He goes out, he keeps on going out to Ginas HaMelech, to the pleasure gardens of the king. They're big into luxurious pleasure gardens, and the garden is being cut down. And the king says, "Why are you doing this?" And the gardener says, "Because he instructed me." And the king said, "Stop, stop! There's something, some confusion going on here." And the gardener says, "There's only one tree left, and I'm about to saw it down." And the king stops him, and eventually, this is interpreted to the king as you're destroying the Exilarch dynasty. There's one left, and you can still save the dynasty before it's too late. And the king decrees that safety if anyone comes forward, and this one child comes forward and establishes a claim, and the king gives him education and pays for his upbringing and restores the position of the Reish Galusa. And this child is known as Bustan. Bustan is the Persian word for pleasure garden or orchard or the like. Thus goes the story. Again, like many of these stories, difficult to know the historicity of it, but it's linked to the Mar Zutra revolt. And I'll simply just mention him as one example of the Rosh Galusa. The final Rosh Galusa I'll mention is a contemporary of Rav Gaon, a great, an outstanding figure. Name is Chizkiah. He is so outstanding that he's appointed post Rav Gaon. You're always told Rav Gaon is the last Gaon. In fact, I said this myself. It's not quite technically true because Chizkiah is appointed as the successor to Rav Gaon. He's both a Gaon and a Reish Galusa. Unfortunately, he's the last Gaon and the last Reish Galusa because he's killed in very short time into his reign, and never managed to flourish as a Gaon or as a Reish Galusa. And with this comes to an end the Gaonic period and the Reish Galusa period. Tragically, later lay leadership in Bavel occasionally ascribed to themselves the title of Reish Galusa, but this is really deemed the end of the position of Reish Galusa with its authority and its recognition by the the Persian court. Okay, so this is the Reish Galusa. I should mention, by the way, there's a couple of hundred years, where there are two parallel Reish Galusa dynasties operating in parallel. One is the Karite Reish Galusa dynasty, and the other one is the what we would recognize as the Rabbenu Reish Galusa dynasty. Yes. Sorry.
Isn't it somewhat anachronistic that we still today
yes.
pray from your program?
Yes. Oh, so I mentioned right at the beginning of the series, the first year, I asked who composed your Komporkan, and I said very often, I said whenever you meet, but that was a mistake. But very often when you meet an Aramaic text, it dates back to the Gaonic era. And indeed, I said many of the terms used make no sense to the modern reader, including Reish Galusa, including a Reish Color. What's the language used in your Komporkan? Sorry? Reish Color, yes. Well, Reish Color are, I think I mentioned this, one of the Gaonic institutions, which again dates back really to the Gaonic period, is that they used to have twice a year, and this on Tishri, a massive conference where many Balabatim came, non-Torah scholars came, and they would learn in yeshiva for a month each time, and that was sort of a chizuk for the whole Babylonian community, and various other roles, which these are all dated, that the whole tefillah is a Gaonic era history. I mentioned that polemic attacks against the Karaites ascribe the breakaway, Anan ben David, the founder of the Karaites, they ascribe the breakaway to a Reish Galusa dynastic succession dispute, that Anan ben David held that he was meant to be the successor, and the Geonim sided with his rival, and therefore he wanted to break away from Gaonic authority. As I said, we have no historic evidence for this, but what we do know is that Anan ben David claimed to be the Reish Galusa, and that wasn't the recognized title, and you had these two running in parallel. Lay leadership, most senior lay leadership roles in the Babylonian world, the Rosh Galusa and the authentic one or the accepted one, and the and the Karite rival version. So this is a second area in which the Geonim were involved. The balance of power, to what degree do lay leadership have a right to get involved in rabbinic succession and political roles and the like? Yes.
As successors to Reish really interesting.
What, today?
Yes.
Oh, the Nangor family. Oh, very interesting. Okay. Okay. I know nothing about this. I didn't know this. I imagine historians are fairly skeptical of it, but I don't know. As I said, the title of Reish Galusa did carry on in Bavel, was occasionally claimed by lay leadership in Bavel in later centuries. But the last recognized Reish Galusa was Chizkiyahu, and with that was the end of the Gaonic era. We call Achai Gaon the last Gaon because he was the last functioning Gaon, but technically Chizkiyahu was both Gaon and Reish Galusa. He must have been an extraordinary individual. But with that ended the era of the Gaonim. Very interesting. So I'll look into this. Okay, one final area of machlokas, and this is very, very important halachically. This is a very serious topic and a very, very misunderstood topic. From a political side, you could say, links to a debate between the authority of Bavel and the authority of Eretz Yisrael. From a halachic side, is a really important halachic argument, machlokas, about the functioning of the Jewish calendar. Now, anyone who's involved in Jewish calendar calculations knows that the Jewish calendar calculations are complicated for many reasons, including that we are trying to align a solar and lunar calendar together. And if we just took a lunar year, it'd be pretty simple. Every new moon, you make a new month, and you just sort of every 12 months is a year. However, more or less, 12 multiplied by lunar months ends up as about 11 days short, or over 3 years, about a month short, and therefore you end up with a misalignment. Now, we want to have our cake and eat it. We want to use a lunar month, and on the other hand, we want a solar year, because Pesach has to fall in spring, and to align the two together, we have to add leap years into periodically, roughly every 3 years, or more accurately in our calendar, every 7 out of 19 years, and which is not far off a third. And that way we align the solar and the solar year with the lunar months. In addition, we have various other things that we want the calendar to tweak. We want various dates not to fall on days of the week for other extraneous calculations. For example, we don't want to lose Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah is so important. Therefore, we don't want Hoshana Rabbah to fall on a Shabbos. And that means that Rosh Hashanah, the famous Lo Adu Rosh Hashanah can't fall on Adu, Aleph Daled Vav, it can't fall on a Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday. And there's a whole array of calendar rules. Now, all of this basically means that we have a calculated calendar. And if you know the algorithms and you know the rules, you can calculate the calendar to infinite years in advance, however far you want to go. And indeed, the calendar producers do this every year, and they publish a calendar. And what could be easier than that? Now, when was this calendar pattern established? When did this actually happen? How did this work? What's the history of this? So, as we are aware, or are we aware? We'll have to see. But as we are told, and we're told this because of the authority of the Rambam, and the Rambam became such a dominant figure that what he said almost became the status quo, the norm. So I'm now going to summarize the sort of normal version of history, the mainstream version of history, the history that we're sort of taught to teach our school kids, and it is accurate as far as the Rambam is concerned. Historically, the declaration of the new moon was done by observance of empirical facts. Witnesses would come to Beis Din, and they would declare the new moon, and that's how we knew when it was Rosh Chodesh. And similarly, the sages would watch as the year began drifting out of alignment, and if they saw that it's still very wintry and Pesach is due, they would add in an Adar Sheni, and there would be a leap year, and that would, the 13th month, would realign the calendar with ensuring that Pesach is in spring. And that's a functioning system, and that works, by the way. You don't need to be a major mathematician, you don't need to be a major scientist, you just watch what's going on, and you can function it. Now, it may happen to be a very cold year for some reason, and then you'll add in an extra Adar Sheni, but no terrible harm done, because you can do that. And then you may then have a few more years without an Adar Sheni, because things got a little early, or maybe a very warm year, and therefore you don't add in an Adar Sheni, so that year Pesach will be a little earlier, but then the next year things would get realigned, and that's a perfectly functioning system. The Rambam then continues that eventually persecution made this impossible, and sometime near the late middle period of the Amaraim, in the generation of Rava and Abaya, the calendar was the calendar, it became impossible to establish the calendar over using this empirical method. Roman persecution meant that they were persecuted out of being able to create the calendar in that manner, and instead a figure called Hillel II, the last Hillel of the Hillel dynasty, he read what was happening, he read the tea leaves of history, he understood that the Nossi role and the authority of the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael was going to go into terminal decline, and he established the fixed calendar, which we use henceforth. Thus says the Rambam. Now, no, Amoraic period. Hillel II is an Amora. Yes, the authority of Eretz Yisrael, roughly, again, so let me just align history. Hillel I, the founder of the Hillel dynasty, is a relatively early Tana, an early Mishnaic rabbi. For 15 generations, his family are the senior religious leadership, not political leadership, in Eretz Yisrael. They are the Nissim. Hillel, in the middle of the Hillel dynastic era, the great towering figure of Rabbi Huda Hanossi arises, who writes the Mishnah. The next generations are Amaraim. But Hillel's family continues to reign supreme from a religious point of view over the world of Eretz Yisrael, and they continue to be Mekadesh the Chodesh. They continue to declare the new moon using authority at the time. In the middle to end, in the late middle period of the Amoraic period, a number of things happen. Torah scholarship declines in Eretz Yisrael, and with that is the closing of the Yerushalmi, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the so-called Talmud Yerushalmi, the Galilean Talmud, which is never properly edited and therefore has less authority than the Bavli, because there's a mass wave of immigration to Eretz Yisrael, which we discussed in previous shiurim. And Hillel II acknowledges that Eretz Yisrael is going into eclipse. However, Eretz Yisrael, Kiddush HaChodesh, has to take place in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he institutes the fixed calendar. And this roughly aligns with the period of Abaya and Rava. Now, we know these dates from, in a sense, competing or semi-contradictory sources. The Rambam speaks about Abaya and Rava being the era when the calendar is fixed. Gaonic sources link this to the figure of Hillel II. The Talmud Yerushalmi links this to but either way, the two periods correspond. They're the same time in history, and that's when the fixed calendar takes effect. Yes?
So I think, yeah,
yes.
That said, not mentioned in the Banana of
Yes. 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 Yeah. And I'm going to come on to this. Okay. So the question is, we know that we have a fixed calendar. How did this transition occur? Both in what way did this occur, and what gives halachic authority to this transfer of system? So the Rambam and the Ramban, in a famous dispute, discuss this point, and the Ramban argues that Hillel II was Mekadesh the Chodesh. He declared the new Rosh Chodesh for all time. In other words, who has authority to declare Rosh Chodesh? The head of the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael, who says he can only declare 1 month. Maybe, thus argues the Ramban, he has the ability to declare infinite months. And therefore Hillel declared all future Rosh Chodesh. Now, no one thinks that he spent hours and hours of time saying this date and this date and this date and this date for 12 times, 1,600 years and counting. But rather what he did was he put in place various algorithms and rules, and he said, henceforth, Rosh Chodesh should always fall as per these algorithms. And that was a sort of mathematical declaration of Kiddush HaChodesh. This is the Ramban's view on the authority to do so. The Rambam voices an alternative opinion, and the Rambam says, no, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael maintain the authority to declare Rosh Chodesh. We looked at the Rambam's view that the collective population of Eretz Yisrael have an equivalent halachic authority to the Sanhedrin. We looked at that when we looked at the debate around the restoration of Semicha, and whether the original chain of tradition ordination could be reintroduced. I'm not going to go through all of that again. But the Rambam says it's true the Sanhedrin have halachic authority to declare Rosh Chodesh. Nonetheless, the collective population of Eretz Yisrael have equivalent authority, and all Hillel did was gave them the calculations and said, live by these calculations. And since the Jewish population of Eretz Yisrael keep these calculations, that's what creates the calendar system to this day. So in a sense, there is still a declaration of Rosh Chodesh ongoing. I'll come to a minute. So there's still a declaration of Rosh Chodesh ongoing in history. The declaration is taking place through a sort of unanimous Eretz Yisrael population of Jews who are living in line with that Rosh Chodesh, and that creates the continued ongoing calendar pattern. Says the Rambam, were, God forbid, there ever to cease to be a Jewish community living in line with Jewish calendar in Eretz Yisrael, we would be in a mess. We would have to think of some other way of construction. We would have to restore Sanhedrin. I don't know what we'd have to do. But miraculously, this has never happened. And I mentioned this already, that though there was a significant decline in Jewish population, particularly round about from the year 1000 to the 1200, that was the low point of Jewish population in Eretz Yisrael, and the low point of scholarship. There were always from Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. It's not true that it was devoid of Jews. And this is how Kiddush HaChodesh takes place to this day. So that's the historic fact that somehow or other there's halachic authority granted to an alternative method of Kiddush HaChodesh, not using empirical observation. Now, sorry, Leonard, apologies.
No, I was under the impression that even when we used Kiddush HaChodesh with the Sherira, with actually
Yes.
that they actually were running it sort of intact.
Yes, I will come to this. Yes,
So
I'll come to this. I'll come to this exactly. Yes. Now, so just to summarize so far, and now I'll add in the words more or less because of Leonard's interjection, which is absolutely right, and we need to understand this. More or less, in a pre-Hillel II world, they are empirically declaring Rosh Chodesh. In a post-Hillel II world, they are using a calculated system, though whether that calculated system is still based upon a type of declaration of the Beis Din or not is a subject of debate. That's roughly how things work according to the Rambam's understanding. Now, what is a historic fact is that the Beis Din had some flexibility even in the empirical era, and this is discussed extensively in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, in which they could choose to declare Rosh Chodesh ahead of Eidim, or to not declare Rosh Chodesh even though Eidim had come, and they would do so for various reasons, various calculation reasons. So they had some degree of flexibility even in the pre-Hillel II era. And this was the subject of a very famous debate between Rabbi Shua and Rabban Gamliel, in which Rabbi Shua believed that Rabban Gamliel is the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, but Rabbi Shua is deemed the wisest sage of his generation, and Rabbi Shua disagrees with Rabban Gamliel's calculation, and Rabban Gamliel says to Rabbi Shua, I don't care, I'm the Nasi, this is what I've decided, I'll come to you in a moment, this is what I've decided should be the calendar, and I have authority to do that, and I can't afford you to let there be a schism in Klal Yisrael, and I need you to turn up on your Yom Kippur day, being Mechalal Yom Kippur in public in order to demonstrate that you accept my authority, and that led to a temporary displacement of Rabban Gamliel, people upset, and a whole story that's discussed in the Gemara. But the idea of based in authority and unanimity needed for calendars for obvious reasons. What greater divide could there be in the Jewish world than disparate calendars? That's an absolute disaster. That's a historic fact. Yes, Amrom.
There's a basic authority to bind Klal Yisrael until Messianic times. So when they set the calendar and said this is it, there's no movement from this. There's a basic of today, I'm sure you find a basic 1,000 years from now, per question. And the follow-up on that is apparently the calculation we use now uses a day, but every 280 years.
Okay,
so,
I'm going to touch upon these points. So just for those online, Avram is asking, how does a Beis Din have authority for all future times? And secondly, our calendar calculation is a little bit off. So what happens if, God forbid, we are in exile for many more thousand years and the calendar is slowly drifting off piece? So the answer is, at least with respect to Kiddush Chodesh, since this is the authority maybe of the Grand Sanhedrin in the Nossi and the Great Sanhedrin, or members of the Great Sanhedrin at least in Eretz Yisrael, therefore they do have authority for all time, at least until a new Sanhedrin replaces it. I have botted in or lesser botted in, but we're not the Sanhedrin HaGadol. And what do we do with the drifting calendar? And if you do the maths, we I was going to say thankfully, but I don't mean thankfully, because God, please God, shouldn't last that long. But we have many, many tens of thousands of years left, where even though the drift will become increasingly problematic, it won't step over the halachic threshold of Pesach falling before too far off the spring season. So we won't end up with Pesach in summer or in winter for many, many tens of thousands of years. I believe the calculation is over 100,000 years, as far as I know. Okay, so just to summarize, already from the Rambam, we have a dating of the fixed canon in the generation of Rava and Abaya, which roughly aligns with another tradition recorded, as David mentioned in the Sefer Ibo, in this 12th century work, of linking it to the second Hillel HaKatan. But either way, the two traditions don't contradict in terms of the historical timeline. Equally, even in the empirical era, the pre-Rava Abaya, pre-Hillel II time of history, there was some tweaking of dates, and again, that's an established Gemara. That's not a controversial act. That there was rabbinic authority to so do. Now, there are some suggestions that the shift between the two models wasn't as black and white or as digital as this formulation suggests, and this has particularly been pushed forward by academic research in the last sort of 40 years. Many of you will know Sasha Stern's involvement in this research. Sasha Stern is a from academic in King's, I think, in UCL, who has written a very, very large book on the subject, which I was privileged to be able to read. And he's also got a shorter version of it. And he's been one of a handful of scholars who have somewhat questioned this narrative. And there are traditional sources that also indicate, which he is aware of, he's a Talmud Chacham, and he also brings evidence of. But basically speaking, what I'll try to share with you now is what I think is a sort of a mainstream view that roughly aligns both the traditional perspective and the academic perspective. The gulf isn't vast here. It's not like a sort of completely different version of event, but it simply modifies and softens the transition from one model to the other model. And the first thing to point out is that in maybe even as long as the last 3 centuries of the empirical Kiddush HaChodesh, the courts in Eretz Yisrael tried to align the calendar with various algorithms. In other words, it wasn't just that they were taking witnesses and receiving witnesses, and here and there, occasionally ignoring the witnesses for one-off sporadic reasons that were necessary, but they were consistently trying to ensure that the calendar fitted various calculated alignments. And the reason for this, perhaps, was because they didn't want there to be a major discrepancy for the Jews in Bavel. In other words, there's now a massive Jewish population in Bavel. The Jewish population in Bavel is superseding the Eretz Yisrael population, and they didn't want there to be chaos in Bavel. There were communication problems between the two, much more than the Mishnaic era mentions problems, but you now have empires at war with each other, because Eretz Yisrael is under Roman rule, and Bavel is under Babylonian rule. These are Persian rule. These are competing empires, and therefore tension between the two communities, not always easy to communicate. The Babylonian king seems not to have liked the idea that his calendar was being fixed by Jews in the Roman Empire, and therefore it seems that on some voluntary level, the later years, perhaps the last couple of centuries of Eretz Yisrael Kiddush HaChodesh, they are behaving more algorithmically, even though they are still doing empirical declaration of Kiddush HaChodesh. So that's one thing that's taking place, and the Gemara already makes reference to this fact. Okay, we now go to the other end of the spectrum, which is Eretz Yisrael now has gone on to sharp decline, the era of Abba and Rava, according to an oral tradition only recorded later, the era of Hillel II, and Christian persecution, and Hillel decides we're now moving over to completely fixed calendar. As I already mentioned, the pshat isn't that Hillel sends a printed or handwritten calendar to the diaspora with the future dates of Rosh Chodesh all the way through for the next tens of thousands of years. But what he does is he creates algorithms from now on via which the Jewish calendar is going to operate. Who is given this algorithm? Who does the calculation? Is there still a declaration of Kiddush HaChodesh taking place, even though it's now 100% working in an algorithmic manner? And the answer is that, as far as we can tell, it's still being done in Eretz Yisrael by the successors of Hillel II, with them still declaring Rosh Chodesh on the day of Rosh Chodesh. So what do I mean by that? They have now completely restricted themselves. They say we can't always be sure that the courts will convene, that we'll always manage to receive evidence, but we're not letting go of Eretz Yisrael being the place where Kiddush HaChodesh is declared, where Rosh Chodesh is declared, and we're certainly not letting go of Eretz Yisrael authority. We are continuing to declare Rosh Chodesh, using the rules of Hillel now, but we are still the ones doing the mathematical calculations, and we are still the ones declaring Rosh Chodesh here in Eretz Yisrael. In addition, we are declaring the Ibor Chodesh, the rules of when there's an extra month, and we have descriptions of ceremonies taking place on Har Zeisim. They can't access Har Abayis, but they can access Har Zeisim on Hoshana Rabbah, led by the Geonim and the like. So led by the Rosh Yeshivas, the Eretz Yisrael Geonim, the Eretz Yisrael Rosh Yeshivas. So in brief, not two softenings of the position. The pre-Hillel second period, the empirical era, they are using some calculations, and the post-Hillel the second period, or the post-Rav and Abai period, the source and the seat of the declaration of Rosh Chodesh is still in Eretz Yisrael, is still being declared through a Kiddush HaChodesh process of the Eretz Yisrael Rosh Yeshiva. In addition, to what degree did Hillel thrash out these algorithms, or did he just give general rules but leave specifics still to his successors? So what we are moving from is this very neat divide of empirical to algorithm, to some degree of algorithm even beforehand, and some degree of Eretz Yisrael autonomy, and perhaps even Eretz Yisrael flexibility in the post-calculation era. Yes?
There is a change that takes place. They're no longer taking evidence, they're taking...
Main change is that they're moving to a calculation model, but not necessarily a fully fleshed out calculation model, maybe yes, maybe not, and certainly not one, what we do know as a historic fact is, not one where the algorithm is distributed widely, and one where Eretz Yisrael is still claiming authority to declare Kiddush Chodesh. Okay, now let's fast forward in time. And I'm just going to try and use the remaining minutes just to summarize what happens next. And this is now the year 922. And a number of things have occurred. The formula of Eretz Yisrael, of Hillel II, or whoever it was in Eretz Yisrael who composed it, has leaked. And Babylonian Jews now know it. And they are doing their own calculations. But they are still respecting the authority of Eretz Yisrael. They make the formal declaration, and they declare when Rosh Chodesh is, but it's become somewhat ritualized, because in Bavel they're now perfectly capable of doing their own calculation. Year 92, Reb Aaron ben Meir, the very distinguished Talmud Chacham, Rosh Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, sends messengers, we've done the calculation, and this is next year's calendar, and the Babylonian Jews think they've made a mistake. And chaos breaks loose. And the background to this case is very complicated maths that I'm not going to go into, and a slight variant in how you do the calculation of the thing, which in 99.5% of years has no effect on the calendar, but very, very rarely leads to different outcomes. In this case, a 2-day discrepancy in the outcome. So it's a very small shift in the maths, but the sort of roller coaster, the knock-on effect of this is that it leads to a 2-day discrepancy in the calendar. And the Babylonians say to Reb Aaron ben Meir, we've treated you very nicely, but and we all know the Torah center is now Bavel, which is an undoubted historic fact. Eretz Yisrael has long been into decline. Nothing, sadly, is going on there of great Torah excitement. With authorities, just, eat humble pie, admit you've made a mistake in the calculation, and let's move on. And Reb Aaron ben Meir says, I am the heir to Eretz Yisrael. We are the ones that declare Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh and the calculations. We are Makadosh Chodesh. You're not taking away from us our last Eretz Yisrael authority. And you clever upstart Babylonians think you have the tradition. Well, you don't have the whole tradition. There's a mistake in your tradition because I have the accurate tradition. It's not like he made an arithmetic error. He had a slight variant on the rules, and he refuses to budge. This is a very, very painful divide. And for 1 year, the Jewish world has a different calendar. Shocking. Jews in Eretz Yisrael and perhaps in Egypt and perhaps in Syria are keeping one calendar. Jews in Bavel are keeping a second calendar. The next time this event occurs is about 5 years after that, by a coincidence of calendars. We have no record of the dispute 5 years later, and in a moment I'll explain why. And the next time this occurs is I think, a couple of 100 years later, and there's definitely no dispute by that time, because by that time the Babylonian Gaon has definitely won, but even 5 years later they've won. Interestingly, this year is a year of dispute. So were we still to follow Amaraim ben Meir, we would have a different calendar to the Babylonian calendar. It's very, very rare. By coincidence of calendar, we have a couple more coming up till over the next few years. And then there's going to be, I think, a several 100-year gap before the next dispute year occurs. But no one even knows of this, right? No one's seen two published calendars floating around, so Amaraim ben Meir calendar and a Gaonic calendar. And the basic reason why Amaraim ben Meir was completely wiped out is the great figure of Rav Saadia Gaon. Now, we've run out of time, so next week we will look a little bit more into the continuation of the story, but basically Rav Saadia Gaon's authority is so towering and so massive and so important. He is such an enormous colossus astride the Torah world stage that he shuts off this argument once and for all. And as I said, certainly the dispute didn't last many years, and perhaps even only lasted 1 year, because we don't find any record of the dispute even a couple of years later, when the next time this calendar debate would have had effect. And with that, he brings to a close and establishes what we know as the final version. This was the last great dispute of calendar calculations, really, in Jewish history. So we'll have to carry on now next year, but this is the rise of Rav Saadia Gaon. Next week, I'm going to speak about, I'll finish off the story of Rav Saadia Gaon briefly, to this aspect of the story. I will then speak about other really important Gaonic innovations. I'll then touch upon the life stories of a few of the Gaonim, and then we'll spend a lot of time on Rav Saadia Gaon, whose philosophy really needs to be studied and understood. Such an important figure, but that's we've run out of time. That's where we'll have to stop for today. I wish everyone a wonderful morning. Thank you so much for joining.
So, multiplication.
Yes.